Hello, today we're going to talk about the chemistry of life. So, kind of the little molecules and the little pieces that make up all living things. We've kind of already been doing that since the beginning of the school year, but our focus today is really going to be surrounding the amazing element carbon. All living things are made of carbon. We say that carbon is the foundation of life, and it's a pretty remarkable element. It's got some really unique bonding properties that lend itself to making these, kind of relatively complicated chemical structures. When we say like bonding, we're talking about in this case covalent bonds. So carbon forms covalent bonds, and it can form bonds with up to four other atoms, which is pretty remarkable as well. You'll see that these pictures here show you some of the unique structures that carbon can make. So carbon can make these kind of like straight chains. It can form out little branches here. It can form these double lines here, which are called double bonds. And in that, it can form ring-shaped structures, which is pretty cool. Just looking at these different kind of chemical structures, it's a little bit, it seems a little complicated, but what I want you to focus on is these little lines just mean a bond, and in this case, covalent bonds. And this is the structure. So we need to be able to identify the different types of structures, and then from there, based on the structure, what type of carbon-based molecule it is. But that's in a little bit. So here we also have to build upon the idea that the carbon-based molecules that make up life are made of individual pieces called monomers. They're almost like beads on a necklace. So there's many beads strung together to form the entire necklace. The monomer is the individual bead. The polymer is the entire necklace. And we can refer back to our prefixes here, mono meaning one and poly meaning many. So with that, we have four groups of what we call biological macromolecules or biomolecules or carbon-based molecules. So all those words mean the same thing. I know that's a little bit complicated, but anytime you see carbon, automatically start thinking about the big molecules, the macromolecules that make up living things. And they are grouped into four different classes based on their characteristics and their structure and function. So carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And you may be really familiar with proteins from our study of enzymes already. So starting with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen primarily. That's what this CHO here means. CHO meaning carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And carbohydrates are mainly used as a source of energy. This example here is glucose. Note right off the bat, we see carbons, oxygen, hydrogen, and the structure is a ring. So that is a ring-shaped structure. All carbohydrates form rings. That's how you will know a particular molecule is a carbohydrate looking at its chemical structure. Here's a few more examples of different carbohydrates. Generally speaking, carbohydrates we're familiar with like breads and pastas and cereals. And we can really sum that up to sugars and starches. We can also throw potatoes in there. So your monosaccharides are your simple sugars. Like this, some examples, they look like this, and examples are glucose and fructose. Um, Disaccharides have two sugars combined, sucrose and lactose. And then polysaccharides are some examples are sugars, are starches, excuse me, cellulose and glycogen. I just want to come back here and say that glucose is like what we really think of as sugar, like just a very simple sugar. Fructose is the sugars in fruit. Lactose is the sugar in milks. And then moving forward, we've got examples of these kind of bigger carbohydrates. We call them polymers. We have the polymer starch. Starch is for essentially stores energy in plants. So you can think of it like a potato is really starchy. Cellulose gives plant cell walls their kind of rigidity, their toughness, and it's hard for humans to digest it. But herbivores, animals that eat plants, are really good at digesting cellulose, and using the energy that's stored in there. Glycogen is is another polymer, but instead of storing energy in plants, this is what animals use for storing energy. So these are again complex polymers made of little individual monomers, monosaccharide being the monomer in this case. So we would call each of these little pieces here, the monomers of carbohydrates, a monosaccharide. Moving forward to lipids. Lipids are, I want you to think of like fats, oils, and cholesterol is kind of a sneaky one. Well, we don't necessarily think of cholesterols as being lipids, but we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. They're made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but they're characterized by these little zigzaggy fatty acid chains. And this particular molecule here is a triglyceride. So tri meaning 3 fatty acids, this being a glycerol molecule. The fatty acids are made of carbon and hydrogen, and you may recall that fats and oils and water don't mix. So these fatty acids actually don't like water. They are hydrophobic. But the glycerol is hydrophilic. It likes water. So it's just a little aside about the structure of the triglyceride. And please note at each of these points, there would be a little carbon. And then coming off of the little carbon are hydrogens. But we don't have to draw all that. It's a little bit complicated. We use an abbreviation, if you will, in chemistry and biology of this zigzag. And it's kind of like assumed what it means. So lipids themselves get kind of a bad rap as, oh, fats are bad for you, but they have some very important structures in living things. Yes, they do store energy. The energy is actually really, really powerful in fats. Fats have a lot of stored calories in them. You may have familiarity with that looking at, food labels, and food labels that are high in fat tend to have a lot of calories in them. Calories really should be looked at as potential energy. So lipids, yeah, they do have a lot of energy in them. They're used to make up cell membranes. So clearly all living things are made of cells. And it is the phospholipid bilayer here. The lipids are these little things in the middle that kind of look like tails. And then across the bottom, Here I have some pictured hormones. So this is cholesterol, testosterone, and estradiol estrogen. So it's a female hormone, testosterone being a male hormone. And cholesterol is a hormone, but it kind of again gets this rap of being like something that's bad, like clogging arteries type thing. But it is important for function in living things. Here we have just another kind of structural representation of fats, and it's important to note here that this is our zigzag that I was mentioning before. Here we have our carbon, 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 so on and so forth, and then popping off of it are hydrogens. And we're looking at the zigzag here, and we call this particular structure, so yeah, there's all like single lines here. We call that a saturated fatty acid. But if we look down here, we see some double lines, and those are double bonds. We call those unsaturated fatty acids. Again, it's more kind of a structure kind of connotation, but at the same time, it does have different effects in living things in terms of how these fats are incorporated into the living thing. So, phospholipids, I mentioned before, these are the types of lipids that make up cell membranes. So, here we have a phosphate head. This phosphate head loves water, it's hydrophilic. The tails, remember, these are our fatty acid type tails, and they are nonpolar, which, if you recall, fats and oils and things like that are nonpolar, and they don't like water. They're hydrophobic because remember, water is a polar molecule. Next up, we've got proteins. We've already kind of begun our discussion of proteins, like the protein in our jello, the gelatin, which is comprised of collagen. But proteins are made of the monomer amino acid, and it is 20 different amino acids that essentially build all the different proteins. And this is the basic structure of an amino acid. This red portion here is like a variant group, and it can change. We have a nitrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen bound to a carbon, and then a carbon bound to an oxygen, oxygen, and hydrogen. So here we have this R side chain or R group, and this R group is different depending upon which of the 20 amino acids are specified by a particular protein. We'll get into the nuances of how proteins get made later on. And these individual amino acids, they're linked together. And again, you may have seen, advertisements for different like protein bars or protein shakes, and they advertise, amino acids or 20 different types of amino acids. It's a little gimmicky because proteins themselves are made up of 20 different amino acids, but it's not saying they're not, good for you or anything. But that's all it's really saying. And the name, actually, another name for a protein is a polypeptide. And if you look at this picture, here is one amino acid and here's another one, and then the bond between them is called a peptide bond. And then here again is another peptide bond. Oftentimes, this chemical structure here is just represented by a circle because it is relatively complicated. So when we make or represent a model of a protein, we often kind of draw circles linked together to represent the circles representing those individual amino acids, and that, nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So here's another example of exactly what I was talking about. We have our peptide bonds between our carbons and our nitrogens. And then this here, see all these differing little groups? You may hypothesize that these are our R groups. Okay, so these are all different amino acids. And, in actuality, proteins are extremely diverse, but they are absolutely necessary for all living things. They're in, structural supports and pieces in cells, specifically muscle cells, hair cells. We talked about collagen. They act as biological catalysts in terms of enzymes, antibodies. They serve as transport molecules. They serve very, very important roles regulating biological systems and feedback loops. And there's, just so much you can, if this interests you, the world of proteins is so very interesting and is kind of ever evolving, which is also really cool. And if you see here where it says CHON, that's representing carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen as the primary elements that make up proteins. Last little bit here about proteins. Proteins have a really unique three-dimensional shape. This protein here is hemoglobin, and it's a little bit complicated, but in this kind of tubing here, there are the individual amino acids. And then the amino acids kind of fold upon themselves and fold upon themselves, and we get this unique structure. So if one of the amino acids gets mutated or changed, this can drastically affect a protein's ability to function, even just one amino acid. When I talk about the structures of proteins, there's 4 levels of organization. So that initial level of organization is just kind of that string of amino acids. So all these little circles represent individual amino acids. The secondary structure is essentially like folding the amino acids themselves, kind of folding back on themselves. They can form kind of twists, like spirals, or little sheets, like wavy little sheets. The tertiary structure is when the folding pattern actually folds on itself through these like little interactions, like almost like little attractions. And then lastly, we have quaternary structure. Quaternary structure being when you have multiple amino acids coming together to make amino acid chains coming together to make one single protein, which is pretty neat. So again, primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structures for the 4 levels of organization in proteins. Last but certainly not least, nucleic acids are made of monomers we call nucleotides. Examples are DNA and RNA. So the example here, this is a model, a representation of DNA. This structure here is a 5-carbon sugar. This is a phosphate. And then in the middle, these are our nitrogenous bases. So if we look more closely, this is the structure of a single nucleotide. Again, here's our phosphate, our 5-carbon sugar, and our base. And the individual elements that make up our nucleic acids are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and then phosphorus, which is incorporated into this phosphate group. in terms of what does DNA and what do RNA do. DNA is going to be genetic information in most living things, and RNA actually takes that genetic information and uses it to create proteins. So it's all kind of, everything is connected, which is cool. Here in this last little image, I just wanted to incorporate it because it goes and looks deeply into the nitrogenous bases and their chemical structures, where you can see the carbons, nitrogens, hydrogens, oxygens interacting in the bases. Here is that 5 carbon sugar, and then over here is that phosphate group. So I just like that. I like that over here we got the connections. And this diagram is like a space filling diagram. I thought was pretty cool because it shows you the relative amount of hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen in the bases, and then phosphorus. So I know that was a lot. I apologize for the length, but there's quite a bit of information here. We're going to review it and kind of digest it all down in the future. Thanks so much.